Factfulness, Day 6, pages 39 to 42. The gap instinct. The gap instinct is very strong. The first time I lectured to the staff of the World Bank was in 1999. I told them the labels developing and developed were no longer valid, and I swallowed my sword. It took the World Bank 17 years and 14 more of my lectures before it finally announced publicly that it was dropping the terms developing and developed, and will from now on divide the world into 4 income groups. The UN and most other global organizations have still not made this change. So why is this misconception of a gap between the rich and the poor so hard to change? I think this is because human beings have a strong dramatic instinct toward minority thinking, a basic urge to divide things into 2 distinct groups with nothing but an empty gap in between. We love to dichotomize. Good versus bad, heroes versus villains, my country versus the rest. Dividing the world into 2 distinct sides is simple and intuitive, and also dramatic because it implies conflict, and we do it without thinking all the time. Journalists know this. They set up their narratives as conflicts between 2 opposing people, views, or groups. They prefer stories of extreme poverty and billionaires to stories about the vast majority of people slowly dragging themselves toward better lives. Journalists are storytellers. So are people who produce documentaries and movies. Documentaries pit the fragile individual against the big, evil corporation. Blockbuster movies usually feature good fighting evil. The gap instinct makes us imagine division where there is just a smooth range, difference where there is convergence, and conflict where there is agreement. It is the first instinct on our list because it's so common and distorts the data so fundamentally. If you look at the news or click on a lobby group's website this evening, you will probably notice stories about conflict between 2 groups or phrases like the increasing gap. How to control the gap instinct. There are 3 common warning signs that someone might be telling you, or you might be telling yourself. An over-dramatic gap story and triggering your gap instinct. Let's call them comparisons of averages, comparisons of extremes, and the view from up here. Comparisons of averages. All you averages out there, please do not take offense at what I'm about to say. I love averages. They are a quick way to convey information. They often tell us something useful, and modern societies couldn't function without them. Nor could this book. There will be many averages in this book, but any simplification of information may also be misleading, and averages are no exception. Averages mislead by hiding a spread, a range of different numbers, in a single number. When we compare 2 averages, we risk misleading ourselves even more by focusing on the gap between those 2 single numbers and missing the overlapping spreads, the overlapping ranges of numbers that make up each average. That is, we see gaps that are not really there. Look at the 2 unrelated graphs here, for example. Average math score, average income, dollar per day. The graph on the left shows the gap between the average math scores of men and women taking SAT tests in the United States for every year since 1965. The graph on the right shows the gap between the average income of people living in Mexico and the United States. Look at the huge differences between the 2 lines in each graph. Men versus women, United States versus Mexico. These graphs seem to show that men are better at math than women. and that people living in the United States have a higher income than Mexicans. And in a sense, this is true. It is what the numbers say. But in what sense? To what extent? Are all men better than all women? Are all U.S. citizens richer than all Mexicans? Let's get a better sense of the reality behind the numbers. First, let's change the scale on the vertical axis. Using the same numbers, we now get a very different impression. Now the gap seems almost gone. Now let's look at the same data in a third way. Instead of looking at the averages each year, let's look at the range of math scores or incomes in one particular year. Now we get a sense of all the individuals who were bundled into the average number. Look, there is an almost complete overlap between men and women's math scores. The majority of women have a male math twin, a man with the same math score as they do. When it comes to incomes in Mexico and the United States, the overlap is there, but it is only partial. What is clear though, looking at the data this way, is that the two groups of people, men and women, Mexicans and people living in the United States, are not separate at all. They overlap. There is no gap. Of course, gap stories can reflect reality. In apartheid South Africa, black people and white people lived on different income levels, and there was a true gap between them, with almost no overlap. The gap story of separate groups was absolutely relevant, but apartheid was very unusual. Much more often, gap stories are a misleading over-dramatization. In most cases, there is no clear separation of two groups, even if it seems like that from the averages. We almost always get a more accurate picture by digging a little deeper and looking not just at the averages, but at the spread. Not just a group all bundled together, but the individuals. Then we often see that apparently distinct groups are in fact very much overlapping.